Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. My name is Icarus and we are back to The Whipping Girl, Chapter 7. Or, to be more precise, half of Chapter 7. Because the entire thing is like 24 pages of size 11 font. So, no, we're going through 12 pages today. Because this chapter is very dense and I had a time getting through 12 pages alone. We'll go through the second half of Chapter 7 next week, and then I'll link the two together so people can find them easily. And my usual disclaimer of this book was published in 2007, it was written in 2005, some of the language is outdated. I am reading this as a transmasculine person who has had this book used against arguments about transandrophobia. So while I'm trying to not be biased, I am still coming in with a bias, especially after the first 6 chapters. And with that, I will go to my summarizing thoughts and then we'll start at the beginning and go through all the highlighted bits. As usual, any links that I have that are relevant, they're going to be in the description with a short annotation of what they are. And let's get into it. So I wrote, I cannot read anymore for today. This chapter is incredibly dense in the material it covers, which is mostly how psychology has treated transgender identities, specifically trans femme identities, in the past and the influences that has during Serrano's time when she initially published this book. I find myself constantly frustrated as I read through her examples of poor takes and discover most of them appear to come directly from a then revolutionary but now outdated textbook. We'll dive into that later. I can understand the frustration of medical gatekeeping that's been had, especially in 2005, but I also, as someone who thinks medical and psychological care is important, both in the initial diagnosis as well as the treatment of and life after transition has begun, I find myself not fully agreeing with her. And I'm extremely annoyed with how she chooses to utilize language in this chapter, referring to medical personnel as gatekeepers the entire time, which elicits an automatic resentment in the person reading. So the chapter 7 is titled Pathological Science: Debunking Sexological and Sociological Models of Transgenderism. Sexological being sexology, the study of human sexuality and identity, and sociological, me being more about how society deals with that sort of thing. What I read, we're mostly going through sexology today. And starting in the very first paragraph, I highlight researchers in what is sometimes called the field of sexology have tried to take a multidisciplinary approach, applying their various expertise in psychology, medicine, epidemiology, endocrinology, and sociology to better understand the nature of both typical and exceptional forms of sex, gender, and sexuality. And as another aside, when she mentions typical and exceptional, exceptional just means out of the norm, but isn't a sort of more insulting way of saying abnormal. However, in a climate so permeated by traditional and oppositional sexism, it's virtually impossible to completely separate scientific inquiry from one's own personal and political views. And I wrote pot, meet kettle, because this entire book thus far has been mostly made up of her own biases when it comes to transgender identity and how she defines it, especially the idea that non binary identities are a partial expression of one's subconscious sex. I'm not over that. While some sexologists, such as Magnus Hirschfeld and Alfred Kinsey, seem to have been driven by a desire to make the world safe for those who differ from sexual and gender norms, others have sought to erase or eradicate those exceptional genders and sexualities instead. I wrote again pot, meat, kettle, but all caps this time, mostly because of how this book has since been used against trans masculine and trans men to kind of dismiss our problems. While these latter researchers likely consider themselves well intentioned, they have left a legacy in which naturally occurring exceptional sex characteristics and gender inclinations are routinely viewed as abnormalities, paraphilias, and pathologies. And again, I wrote pot meat kettle. It's not totally analogous, but she's definitely done a good job in damaging intertrans communities with her shitty takes. And again, I find the way that she will later talk about early trans studies, because we have to remember a lot of studies about human sex and gender identities was actually destroyed during World War II by Nazis because it didn't fit in with their shitty takes. So a lot of the current studies really started coming around in the 60s. And at the time, it was pretty revolutionary. It kind of treated trans people like people, even if by modern standards, it's really outdated and wasn't all that great. So I kind of have the same feeling about when I am reading her book, that it was very revolutionary for her time, but now it's so easy to look at it and take it as something that is kind of damaging in its own way. And by the way, this is all still within like the first two paragraphs. One of the most active areas of sexological study has been transsexuality, and that work was possible because trans people have often been required to subject themselves to research in order to gain access to hormones and surgery. This dependent relationship was instituted by the Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association, a professional organization that sets the guidelines for the psychiatric, psychological, medical, and surgical management of gender identity disorders. And I wrote some notes, but I should go ahead and mention I write my notes as I'm reading them, as I'm reading the book, and she does end up bringing this up again later, but my notes probably sound like I don't think she will. So I wrote, I immediately had to stop and look first at her footnotes, of which there are many in this chapter, noticing that she pointed out it's now called WPATH. I was immediately confused because in my limited experience to WPATH, I had heard good things, so I went and looked it up. And what do you know? There's a wiki about this. What Serrano fails to mention here, and in a further quote below, is that before the first standard of care in 1979, there is absolutely no standard for how trans people were supposed to be treated. Looking in the criticism section of the wiki, it's talked about how WPATH has taken criticisms about its guidelines into consideration, and when they periodically update their standard of care, these revisions will reflect those changes. So once again, I find Serrano's picture of something to be incredibly one-sided and biased in favor of whatever she wants to depict. But for transparency's sake, I will continue to quote her below, because then I went on to read until 1998, the HBIGDA Standards of Care stated that any and all recommendations for sex reassignment surgery and hormone therapy should be made only by a clinical behavioral scientist, because these medical procedures are prerequisites for obtaining legal change of sex in the United States. The psychiatric community, as well as other psychologists, physicians, and sexologists who had a hand in establishing the standards of care, has become positioned as gatekeepers of medical and legal sex reassignment. During the last half century, this group has amassed a large body of work on the subjects of transsexuality and transgenderism that has very much shaped the way our culture views and values transgender people, as well as how transgender people come to understand themselves. However, this body of research, though presented as scientific and objective, reveals more about the researchers' biases and assumptions than it does about the transgender population. And I've added, I don't know if this is just because of the passage of time or what, but I have a whole Google spreadsheet bookmarked referencing studies about trans people that was last updated in February 2021 that I feel like will contradict much of what she says moving forward. And I do have to add that this tone that she's striking in what I just quoted is pretty much her tone for the rest of this half of the chapter that we're going over. Because, Again, she uses gatekeepers consistently. You will see that in the quotes that I pull as I was reading. And she doesn't give any grace. Like, she's making assumptions about why people are doing what they're doing instead of recognizing how medical procedures and terminology and how psychology and psychiatric care have evolved since the beginning of time, really. And she mentions some of these procedures later on that were used for a multitude of different mental illnesses because they thought it would work. And I don't know, it bugs me, the fact that she is being so disingenuous about all of this. So the next section is called Oppositional Sexism and Sex Reassignment. And the very first thing is, as I mentioned in previous chapters, trans people who have a subconscious sex that is not in concordance with their physical sex often suffer from gender dissonance, which is best thought of as the psychological strain of having to constantly pretend to be a member of a gender with which they do not identify. And I end up writing, or more simply, as Reed Vanderbaugh explained it in 2001 as an alternative to gender identity disorder in the DSM, describes the distress of incongruence between one's experiences of gender identity and natal sex. She then continues, over the years, sexologists have tried everything imaginable to cure trans people of gender dissonance, including psychoanalysis, aversion, and electroshock therapies, administering assigned sex consistent hormones, i.e., androgens for male body trans people and estrogens for female body trans people, and psychotropic drugs, all to no avail. And as I just said, much like all the other cures that have been used on mental illnesses over the years, including shit like lobotomies. And yes, there is a lot of bad faith, I will admit, in medical care, especially when you research lobotomies. You find out that there is these people that would go around and just poking through the eyeballs and all that shit, and they were doing it mostly to make money, which sucks because then you start getting into the crossroads of capitalism with scientific progress, which we are seeing in the US with how expensive medical care is and how expensive medication can be. So I think there's a lot more going into this than she is making it out to be. You could write multiple papers, dissertations, or another book just on this alone. Jumping down a little bit, I did highlight one of the most prominent advocates for allowing this option of medically transitioning was endocrinologist Harry Benjamin, from whom the HBIGDA was later named. So again, she did bring it up again and talks about Benjamin's first encounter with trans people, being a trans woman, and how he eventually helped her get the medical care. And we're moving down to, in his 1966 book, The Transsexual Phenomenon, Benjamin outlined a 7-point Kinsey-esque scale to describe people on the MTF spectrum, ranging from what he called pseudo-transvestites to true transsexuals. Though it was flawed in some respects, his scale did acknowledge that there were a large variation among trans people in terms of their wanting to temporarily, partially, or completely transition to the other sex, and whether that transition would be of a social, hormonal, and or surgical nature. And I really appreciate that she put that there. I highlighted that as just a kudos, considering how angry I was getting, how she was depicting the W path earlier. And I feel like this is one of the few moments that she talks about how, in the context of the time, this was a positive. Also, fun fact, Benjamin consulted Kinsey when it came to that first transsexual woman that he met. And then, as transsexuality gained more attention, almost all of it negatives, things continued. We're going into the late 1960s, where she says these guidelines for treatment were later codified with the release of the original HBIGDA Standards of Care in 1979. While they have evolved somewhat over the time, especially since the mid-1990s, when they finally began to incorporate changes suggested by the trans community, they follow the same basic outline today. And again, this was in 2005. The last time it's been updated was in 2011, and it actually is what has allowed younger trans people to have access to things like puberty blockers. So they're still processing, developing, taking in information that has come with scientific research that Serrano seems so broadly against and all of this shit. And they are responding to the community and to scientific evidence. So I, again, am just so annoyed. I have a random note of saying I hate how the term gatekeeper is constantly being used, as I then jump into a paragraph that is, while the gatekeepers consistently argued that these methods were designed to protect the transsexual, the way they were executed, especially prior to the mid-1990s, reveals an underlying agenda. Whether unconscious or deliberate, the gatekeepers clearly sought to 1. Minimize the number of transsexuals who transitioned, 2. Ensure that most people who did transition would not be gender ambiguous in any way, and 3. Make certain that those transsexuals who fully transitioned would remain silent about their trans status. These goals were clearly disadvantageous to transsexuals as they limited trans people's ability to obtain relief from gender dissonance and served to isolate trans people from one another, thus rendering them invisible. Funny how that is apparently a problem for this, even though, Anyway, continuing. Rather, these goals were primarily designed to protect the cissexual public from their own gender anxiety by ensuring that most cissexuals would never come face to face with someone they knew to be transsexual. And again, I did not write this as a note, but I feel like she is coming to this with the worst possible interpretation. Moving on, there is another little highlight that I put up. For example, the gender identity clinics that were established to treat and carry out research on trans people often accepted only a small percentage of those who applied to their programs. For example, the program at Johns Hopkins University only approved 24 of the first 2,000 requests they received for sex reassignment surgery. And she has a footnote. It wasn't very helpful for me at this moment, but without knowing more about the Johns Hopkins University sex reassignment surgery thing, I cannot help but relate this to like Draft to Digital releasing a beta program for print on demand, and they only let a few people in at a time to make sure their resources aren't overwhelmed and that it's performing the way it's supposed to. That is something that is not a bug, it's a feature to make sure things aren't going to shit. But again, I don't know right now what exactly this is referring to, if they were artificially restricting it or if they were trying to keep things going and making sure they were doing everything right. I feel Serrano is doing the most negative interpretation, while I am possibly leaning towards the most good faith. And moving on, those who received recommendations were required to continue in therapy through the entire transitioning process, i.e., until after surgery. This requirement of several years of psychotherapy, in addition to the expenses of hormones, surgery, and other procedures that were generally not covered by health insurance, created a huge financial burden that severely limited the number of people who would have the economic means to transition in the first place. And again, Serrano is writing this as a white trans woman in the US. And I agree, this financial burden is shit, but this isn't so much of a problem of the W path as it is a problem with capitalism, but it's also a problem with how healthcare in particular is considered something that you need to buy and shop around for. So it's not the W path, it's how healthcare is treated in the US. Moving on a little bit down, the gatekeepers also kept the number of transitioned transsexuals low by requiring them to conform to oppositional sexist ideals regarding gender. This was primarily achieved by making passing a prerequisite to transitioning. And I wrote, because there was another footnote, Serrano is heavily reinforcing a book called How Sex Changed by Joanne Marowitz, published in 2002. While I don't have the time to go through an entire book here, as this is a layman's reading of The Whipping Girl, I decided to try and do some research into the book itself. And from what I can tell, Marowitz is a historian, very renowned historian, and the book is actually a look into the history of sex and gender and how these terms have changed across time, culture, and society. So I can definitely see this as being a thing, especially because this is what's being looked at through a historical view. And I also think that requiring someone to pass is shitty. Fortunately, times have evolved. We're no longer looking at that so much. And I cannot help but think about how heavily she critiqued Trans America as being a shitty movie when it was giving a very honest display of how people, especially trans women, had to go through all of this shit to perfectly pass, and were hyper aware of it and all of that stuff. Now that's old hat. I've already talked about it. Not only did the trans person have to physically pass as their identified sex, they needed to exhibit the appropriate sexual orientation, heterosexual, and gender expression, masculinity for trans men, femininity for trans women, for that sex as well. And I just add a note of homosexuality was considered officially a mental illness until 1973. So are we really that surprised? Like, we got put back a lot thanks to the Nazis, and we are still fighting against cis heteronormativity to this day. So really, I'm not surprised that as transgender treatments started being rolled out and codified, that they had some pretty shit takes. And then there was, after all, the requirement that trans people had to be heterosexual in their identified sex was enforced long after homosexuality had been removed from the DSM. Highlighting this because, again, I want to be transparent that she does mention that, but still, things move slowly. We're fighting against what's considered the norm. And that means there has to be research, there has to be studies, and then finally, when the scientific community has moved on, we then have to drag people, oftentimes kicking and screaming, into modernity. There is stuff talking about how this focusing on passing and all of that stuff happens to hurt people. This insensitivity towards trans people's pain indicates that the gatekeepers were far more concerned with protecting the cissexual world from the existence of transsexuality than they were treating trans people's gender dissonance. Again, a very bad faith take, while I do think the overarching narrative was protecting cisgender people and cisgender identities. I also can't help but think that by assigning this to the individual people who were trying to help trans people and who were doing research into transgender identities, it's an extremely negative, dare I say, toxic take. Because relief from gender dissonance depended on one's ability to live up to these rigid and oppositional sexist expectations, trans people quickly learned, both by reading the research articles and through conversations with other transsexuals, exactly what they needed to say and how they needed to act in order to procure a recommendation for hormones and sex assignment. Honestly, we still see that to this day. There's a huge issue with medical care, especially if you are a person of color or a woman, because you end up not being taken seriously. Or there's this whole thing where black people supposedly don't experience pain the same as white people, so it's not taken as seriously. I mean, that's fully shit, but it's still being taught to this day. So this is actually just more common in medical care in general. Of course, the gatekeepers eventually realized that many, if not most, trans people were merely telling them what they wanted to hear, and their resentment around this can be found in the articles they publish, which often contains descriptions of transsexuals as being deceptive and liars. I don't really have much to say. I just wanted to include that, and then I jumped down to add, it is particularly hypocritical that gatekeepers accuse trans people of being liars, as their own protocols typically directed transsexuals to lie about their past after transitioning, in what seems to be complete contradiction of the most basic tenets of psychotherapy. Trans people were required to invent gender consistent, i.e., cissexual histories for themselves, so that if they were ever questioned about their past, they would not have to reveal their trans status. So, again, I got distracted by a footnote, and here we go. This and many other footnotes are referring to transsexualism and sex reassignment, a book published in 1969 by John Money and Richard Green. It was the first medical book on transgender people, period. Green is best known for criticizing the classification of homosexuality as a mental illness, and at worst, he's been criticized for calling trans women sissy boys, having a hyper focus on trans women in particular, being generally outmoded, and he actually lived to see his research be overshadowed by modern ideas of transgender identities. We've discussed John Money before. He's the person who forcibly reassigned David Raymer from male to female after a botched circumcision as an infant, and David Raymer was intensely gaslit and traumatized, and as a young adult he ended up committing suicide. So you know my feelings on him. However, again, this book was published in 1969. It is the first medical textbook about transgender people. While it is incredibly outdated today, just like how Serrano's many statements and how she uses language in this book is outdated by today's standards, it was revolutionary at the time, and it actually brought trans people into the discussion of medical care, and I find that to be incredibly important. And the fact that she uses this book as a way to give all of her bad takes is annoying. I also am annoyed that I haven't read Transsexualism and Sex Reassignment. I would love to at some point, but how she's talking about trans people going stealth and lying, and further there's going to be more, it was just as much to protect trans people from cisgender people hurting them. So again, it's a very one-sided view of this whole thing going on. While this requirement was purportedly put into place to protect the transsexual from the cissexual public, like I just said, it is clear that what concerned the gatekeepers the most was protecting the cissexual public from the transsexual. No citation. Proof of this exists in documents of trans people who were open about being transsexual or who attempted to financially capitalize on that status, for example, by becoming entertainers or revealing their stories to the public, being described as sociopathic in medical literature. And she footnotes number 19, so I'm just going to double check that. And it is, again, the 1969 medical textbook, just so you know. Canonical writings on transsexuality also argue that for transsexuals embarking on their transitions, a change in geographic location is almost mandatory, and that continued association with an employer should be terminated so as to avoid any embarrassment to the employer. Emphasis mine. Regarding family, gatekeepers suggest that young children are better told that their parents are divorcing and that daddy will be living far away and probably unable to see them. Guess where that's from? The 1969 textbook. And also the history textbook, but I don't know in what way is it being referenced because I don't have How Sex Changed handy to just double check. So, again, ascribing this to gatekeepers when this is actually from a now extremely outdated and criticized medical textbook. The way she's using language is both admirable in the ability to twist the narrative to how she wants to present it, as well as infuriating when you actually go and look at her sources. Moving on down, for example, one transsexual who became depressed primarily because of her fears that others would discover her trans status and that she would be rejected if she were found out was described by the gatekeepers as still struggling with the problem of gender identification. This is referring to how trans people were having difficulty navigating the world as their new gender. And after hearing how she thinks that maybe psychological care isn't super necessary because of the costs, I find myself seeing this and just, this is why going to therapy and having someone to help walk you through this shit is helpful. What becomes lost in gatekeeper discourse regarding transsexuality, especially with regard to incidents of post-transition depression and transsexual regret, was any distinction between the trans person's gender dissonance and intrinsic matter and the emotional stress the transsexual experienced as a result of having to deal with the gender anxiety of the sexual public, which was an extrinsic matter. Another aside, my patron has told me that I have run-on sentences, and yet. Indeed, the blurring of these separate issues was codified with the invention of the psychological term gender dysphoria, which made invisible the cissexual gender anxiety by conflating it with the trans person's intrinsic gender dissonance. The regular use of the phrase by gatekeepers illustrates their assumption that it was transsexuals' responsibility to shape their lives around the cissexual public's prejudice against them. I think this is just outdated for today. Again, I wasn't part of the trans community in 2005. I wasn't even in high school then. So, based off of what I've seen from media and the like, I can definitely see that. But by today's standards, it's just not a thing anymore. Moving on to the next section, titled Traditional Sexism and Effeminania, which is a word that she made up to describe people's obsession with femininity in masculine bodies. I'm going to skip down to many attempts to explain the gatekeepers' focus on trans women over trans men have centered on the assumption that traditional sexism was occurring based on the trans person's assigned sex. For example, many have pointed out that trans women, having been raised male, tended to have more financial resources to afford the extremely costly therapies and procedures associated with transitioning. Others have argued that a female-bodied person who wanted to transition to male would be taken far less seriously than a male-bodied person who expressed a desire to transition to female. While the idea that a gatekeeper would take a man more seriously than a woman probably played some role in fostering this discrepancy, I would argue that more often than not, traditional sexism tended to work in the other direction. In other words, the gatekeepers focused on MTF spectrum individuals not because of that group's male privilege per se, but because they considered male expressions of femininity to be more disturbing and potentially threatening to society than the female expressions of masculinity. The positive sources, i.e., not the outdated medical book that she keeps referencing, that she's been routinely referring to in this chapter, argue for what she is now arguing against. And I also find it that her distinction, if that's the right word, her argument that it's because female expressions of masculinity just don't matter, is once again feeding into her narrative that trans women are the most oppressed ever. And moving down, we have the idea that male femininity is more psychopathological than female masculinity can be found throughout the transgender specific diagnoses in the most recent edition of the DSM-4. For example, the entry for Transvestic Fetishism, which exempts FTM spectrum trans people, is listed in the DSM as a paraphilia, a psychiatric category for sexual behaviors describing as involving non-human objects the suffering or humiliation of oneself or one's partner or children or other non-consenting persons. The transvestic fetishism diagnosis is written in such a vague way as to include most, if not all, heterosexual men who routinely cross-dress. Catherine Wilson, who writes for GID Reform Advocates, an organization that works to reform the psychiatric classification of gender diversity as a mental disorder, has pointed out how this diagnosis, while targeting male-bodied people, is mired in traditional sexism. And she has a quote from Wilson: "Curiously, women and gay men are free to wear whatever clothing they choose without a label of mental illness. This criterion serves to enforce a stricter standard of conformity for straight males than women or gay men. Its dual standard not only reflects the social privilege of heterosexual males in American culture, but promotes it. One implication is that the biological male who emulate women with their lower social status are presumed irrational and mentally disordered, while biological females who emulate males are not. A second implication stereotypically associates femininity and cross-dressing with male homosexuality and serves to punish straight males who transgress the stereotype." So, I do have some notes, but first, I want to mention that transvestic fetishism is considered a paraphilia because it's including non-human objects. So the fact that she decided to include stuff like the suffering or humiliation of oneself or one's partner, and also the children or non-consenting persons, when it's not relevant, except to kind of cloud the waters a bit, again, using language in a way to bias the reader for a certain idea that she's putting forth. Technically, she's not lying, but she's presenting the information in a way to just most bad faith interpretation possible. So I actually looked at the DSM-4 and I found this information that I'm going to pull up now. It is underneath paraphilias, transvestic fetishism, and it says, "The paraphilic focus of transvestic fetishism involves cross-dressing. Usually the male with transvestic fetishism keeps a collection of female clothes that he intermittently uses to cross-dress. While cross-dressed, he usually masturbates, imagining himself to be both the male and female object of his sexual fantasy. This disorder has been described only in heterosexual males. Transvestic fetishism is to be diagnosed when cross-dressing occurs exclusively during the course of gender identity disorder. Transvestic phenomena range from occasionally solitary wearing of female clothes to extensive involvement in a transvestic subculture. Some males wear a single item of woman's apparel, e.g. underwear or hosiery, under their masculine attire. Other males with transvestic fetishism dress entirely as females and wear makeup. The degree to which the cross-dressed individual successfully appears to be female varies, depending on mannerisms, body habits, and cross-dressing skill. When not cross-dressed, the male with transvestic fetishism is usually unremarkably masculine. Although his basic preference is heterosexual, he tends to have few sexual partners and may have engaged in occasional homosexual acts. An associated feature may be the presence of sexual masochism. The disorder typically begins with cross-dressing in childhood or early adolescence. In many cases, the cross-dressing is not done in public until adulthood. The initial experience may involve partial or total cross-dressing. Partial cross-dressing often progresses to complete cross-dressing. A favored article of clothing may become erotic in itself and may be used habitually, first in masturbation and later in intercourse. In some individuals, the motivation for cross-dressing may change over time, temporarily or permanently, with sexual arousal in response to the cross-dressing diminishing or disappearing. In such instances, the cross-dressing becomes an antidote to anxiety or depression, or contributes to a sense of peace and calm. In other individuals, gender dysphoria may emerge, especially under situational stress with or without symptoms of depression. For a small number of individuals, the gender dysphoria becomes a fixed part of the clinical picture and is accompanied by the desire to dress and live permanently as a female and to seek hormonal or surgical reassignment. Individuals with transvestic fetishism often seek treatment when gender dysphoria emerges. The subtype with gender dysphoria is provided to allow the clinician to note the presence of gender dysphoria as part of transvestic fetishism. So, I would not say that's as vague as she is saying at all. And I found other information from the DSM 5, which is the most up to date version, and a sort of breakdown on the paraphilia as described in the description below. I'm providing those links. But essentially, there's apparently very few to no studied cases of transvestic fetishism in women or trans men because it's just not super common, apparently. This is already a very rare medical diagnosis or medical paraphilia or whatever you want to call it. So there is definitely something here about possibly why we are conflating the idea of sexual arousal to feminine objects and femininity. But again, this is just coming across as fairly disingenuous. Moving on, Serrano has another paragraph about how pursuing femininity in boys is much more punished than masculinity in girls, where she mentions a simple preference for cross-dressing or simulating female attire meets the diagnostic criteria for gender identity disorder for boys, but not for girls, who must insist on wearing only male clothing to merit diagnosis. This is for children. This is, again, it's out of date, I believe. I didn't double check the DSM 5 for this in particular, but this doesn't have the sting of being worse for male-bodied people that she thinks it does. It's just showing actually a way that trans men and masculine people end up being way more heavily taxed by the medical community. And this is beyond the fact that medical community does not have much information about trans masc people, or there's a lot of misinformation that's not easily corrected. Going on, she kind of talks about Green and the Sissy Boy Syndrome book that he published. Thankfully, like, all of this is pretty much out of date in today's standards, so I'm not going to go into it. Then we go into one of the characteristic traits of effeminate maniac. Could she not have made that a little easier to say? Research is that it tends to conflate feminine gender expression, male homosexuality, and male to female transsexuality with one another, often treating them as though they were different symptoms of the same quote-unquote disease. This is evident in the theories psychiatrists and sexologists have offered to explain the etiology of these phenomena, which have since been debunked, is what I add to Serrano. So, moving on. Effeminate mania in sexology has led to the creation of additional labels and subcategories for male to female spectrum trans people that are rarely, if ever, applied to female to male spectrum individuals. The most common of these is the distinction between transvestites and transsexuals. My only note is a big reason why transvestite is more associated with male-bodied trans people is because drag queens and other transvestite scenes in pop culture and the like, they're much more focused on male to female. If we look through history, we see a lot of gender nonconforming women who, in today's day and age, probably would have identified as transgender, but because there wasn't so much stuff around being female to male, they were instead put in as being butch, dykes, cross-dressers, they were never given a chance to be labeled transvestite or transgender. Then just a really quick thing of, according to gatekeeper lore, and gag me for that, again, just absolute the way she's using language in this. Jumping all the way down, there is a note about autogynephilia, where is being talked about Bailey, who was trying to talk about how there's two different types of male to female, homosexuals and heterosexuals, that sort of thing. And she says, despite the fact that the concept of autogynephilia, which was originally coined by fellow gatekeeper Ray Blanchard in the late 1980s, is based on dubious evidence and has never been scientifically substantiated, it also appears in the DSM. So I brought up the DSM-5. It's still in there, but then I looked up Julia Serrano's blogspot, and this thing that she published in 2015 got updated in 2019. There is actually a study that talks about autogynephilia in cisgender women, and appears like anywhere between 28% to 93% of cisgender women experience autogynephilia. It really depends on how you sort of explain it, but by the most common definition of ever having erotic arousal to the thought or image of oneself as a woman, 93% said yeah. So that's interesting. Autogynephilia is a thing. It's just not a trans woman exclusive thing, and it's not necessarily why trans women transition. In fact, I would say it's not. It's just a happy side effect of feeling happy and aroused in your own fucking body. And we're going to skip down a bit more, because effeminate. I hate this. Because effeminania is first and foremost an expression of traditional sexism, and because the gatekeepers often work from the implicit assumption that femininity is inferior to masculinity, it should be no surprise that they view male femininity to be a greater concern than female masculinity. Again, we're talking about doctors, we're talking about psychiatrists, we're talking about psychologists, we're talking about therapists. And even in 2005, I find it hard to believe that everyone involved in transgender care were all obsessed with male femininity and thought femininity was less than. Again, we look at Legally Blonde. That came out a couple of years before this book started being written. So what do we say about that? I don't know. Again, the most bad faith takes on individuals who have been working and studying and expanding transgender knowledge. Some might be inclined to view effeminmania as simply a manifestation of homophobia or transphobia, but this would be inaccurate. Effeminmania specifically targets femininity rather than homosexuality or transsexuality as a whole. There is a discussion on how Richard C. Friedman, a psychoanalyst and the author of Male Homosexuality, a contemporary psychoanalytic perspective, speaks rather admirably about gay men who exhibit masculine traits while correlating adult gay male effeminacy with a global character psychopathology in what he calls the lower part of the psychoconstructural spectrum. And while all forms of transsexuality are still formally pathologized, it has become quite common for gatekeepers to claim that trans men are more psychologically stable than trans women. Often such comments are made without any further explanation, leading one to suspect that these characterizations stem from the gatekeeper's unspoken assumption that masculinity and the desire to be male are in and of themselves more rational and healthy tendencies than femininity and the desire to be female. Another issue that seems to fuel effeminmania and our cultural tendency to sexualize femininity and femaleness in all its forms. While countless feminist writers and theorists have analyzed ways in which the sexualization of femaleness and femininity permeates virtually every aspect of our culture and has a negative impact on most women's lives, they have typically ignored the way this tendency creates an environment in which male femininity is almost always considered in purely sexual terms. For example, most popular images and impressions of trans women revolve around sexuality, from she-male and chicks with dicks, pornography, to media portrayals of us as sexual deceivers, prostitutes, and sex workers. And of course, there are the reoccurring themes of trans women who transition in order either to gain the sexual attention of men or fulfill some kind of bizarre sex fantasy, both of which appear regularly in media and also in Bailey and Blanchard's model of MTF transgenderism. That's as far as we're getting for the day. I wanted to leave that at the end because I am, again, annoyed with the leading one to suspect that these characterizations stem from the gatekeeper's unspoken assumptions, because she is putting words not into people's mouths but into people's minds. That's gross. And I actually agree that there is a lot of male femininity that seems sexualized to some extent. And that's why I think the fetishistic transvestism thing is still in the DSM, because society, especially the US society, has fetishized women's underwear and women's paraphernalia to men, so they may start wearing this stuff and eventually realize, oh shit, I'm trans. I've seen it happen before. But we'll continue the rest of this chapter next week, because again, this has taken me about 3 hours to read and write and speak, and it's probably going to take me another hour to edit this video, edit out some of my ums and inability to say words. But yeah, this is a very heavy, dense chapter, and I am high-key infuriated and impressed at how she utilizes language. I need to take a leaf from her book. But that's going to be it from me today. If you want to catch the next chapter, do subscribe and ring the bell, since people don't get notifications when people update. Otherwise, I'll see you on Friday when we do another sex ed thing. Bye.